Right now I'm on a possibly 5,000, definitely 4,000 mile, possibly 6-week, possibly 2-month road trip from the mountains of North Carolina, where I now live, and where I lived when I was a teenager. I was lucky enough to be able to go back after my husband died and spend some time with my mother before she died. But before that, I lived for 25 years in Washington, D.C., and 18 of those years, from April 13th, 1984 to December 8th, 2002, I was out in front of the White House. And for 15 of those years, I was there day and night. Not every single moment of every single day, of course. You have physical needs and you have friends who help you out, but I did that for 18 years. And my message was abolish nuclear weapons, disarm the planet, trust God and disarm everywhere, stop selling weapons in war, turn all military into Peace Corps. I had all sorts of messages over the years. But the most important message that we had was Proposition 1, and that was born in the 1980s when we started circulating a petition asking the then USSR and the United States to agree to abolish their nuclear weapons and to use the money that was saved instead to shut down and clean up the nuclear weapons industries and to provide for human needs. And we collected hundreds of thousands of signatures over the years, mostly from people from other countries, as you can imagine. We were scorned and yelled at, and our signs were kicked and knocked over, but nothing really bad happened, you know. Most of the time it was just silliness. And we talked to a lot of people. The Park Service estimated that there were 3 million people a year who came to see the White House. And we saw a percentage of that, and any percentage of that would be good. And when we started our vigil, people thought we were communists and crackpots, but we won them over the years just by being consistent and being logical. And the Reagan administration tried to get rid of us in a number of ways. There were a number of laws written to try to turn us into criminals for camping, and we actually, a number of us spent 2 or 3 months in prison in 1988 for camping. And it was federal prison because it's a federal park. And of course, a federal prison is better than a local prison because it's fancier. You know. I went to Lexington, Kentucky, and that was the last year that it was a co-educational, low-security prison. And I've got some tales to tell about that, but I won't tell them right now. And then the judge who sent us to prison, initially he dismissed the charges against us on the grounds that we were exercising our religious belief because we filed some motions. Each one of us that was being prosecuted filed motions and explained our own personal beliefs. But the Court of Appeals sent it back to him, and Judge Charles Ritchie was his name. And he, when he found us guilty and was telling us that he was sentencing us right then and that we weren't going to have to go through any kind of analysis of anything, we were just off to jail and this is what we were going to do. He said, I know your cause is noble and I know you're going to come right back, but I'm hoping by sending you to prison it will deter others from adopting your lifestyle. And he was right. It did. And we did. I was the first one out. And those first couple of weeks before my husband came back were kind of spooky. You know, I didn't sleep too well on the sidewalk when the police were going by. But, you know, if you're a mother, you're used to getting up if you hear a noise, right? So I've been well trained for that. My kids didn't need me anymore in 1984. I had been paralegal, and I'd sold real estate, and at the time that I encountered the vigil that had been in front of the White House for 3 years in 1984, I was working as the administrative assistant to the CEO of the National Wildlife Federation, which that year the shareholders, at the shareholders meeting, they issued a call to President Reagan to get rid of nuclear weapons, and I thought that was a wonderful idea. And one night I was going through Lafayette Park. I was writing a play about homeless people because when I came to D.C. from Minnesota, where I had been living, in 1983, I started noticing that there were homeless people, because you don't see them in Minnesota, right? It's too cold. Somebody takes them in at night, you know. But, and I started writing about the fact that President Reagan, thanks to Nancy, was having the steam grates covered over so that the homeless people would stay warm on the steam grates that were coming out of the buildings. And it was called the Grate People, G-R-A-T-E. And I was looking for the main character of my play, and when I encountered this little woman lying on the sidewalk in a ski suit between two big signs, and one said, "Mr. President, why don't you come out with the forced homeless?" And the other said, "Rip over a mushroom cloud." I mean, this was a big sign. This was 8 feet by 12 feet, and it said, "Revelation, this need not be our end." And I had come to Washington, D.C. from Minnesota because I had encountered the Women Against Military Madness in Minneapolis. And they had an event against nuclear weapons. And I went to it and I saw this very small number of people who were there. And I thought, well, this is really what I want to be doing with my life. I really want to try to get rid of nuclear weapons because I really don't want my children to die in a nuclear war. But I'm not going to get anywhere in Minneapolis, Minnesota, so I'm going to go to Washington, D.C., and I did. And but when I encountered the vigil, my daughter was living with me. She had just graduated from high school. And she told me she was moving out of the house to live with her girlfriend, and I said, "Oh, good, so am I." And I gave her everything I owned. And with a backpack, I went out to the White House sidewalk, and I didn't have a roof over. My daughter was horrified, of course, and my mother was horrified. But they got over it. And it was quite an adventure and a huge learning experience. And we have some of the highlights of this were, well, let's see, in 1986 and 87, Dr. Charles Hyder came to town, and he was quite successful in convincing the Germans not to put their nuclear waste into a salt cavern because he was a nuclear physicist, and he proved, an astrogeophysicist, and he proved that the heat from the radioactive materials would melt the salt, and the melted salt would rise to the surface. And so the Germans didn't do it. And he came and saw what we were doing and was impressed with what we were doing. And he started a fast. And he weighed 310 pounds when he came. And he weighed 140 pounds when his fast was over. He started in September 1986, and he announced that he was ending his fast on May Day, 1987. In the meantime, Gorbachev heard about him and wrote a letter asking him to quit fasting. He became rather famous in the process. And while he was there, Charles and Thomas, who was the founder of the Vigil in 1981, I met him in 84, and within 6 weeks we were married. I'm not telling the story very well. I'm sort of jumping around. I apologize, but there's so much to say. And Thomas and Charles and I sat down and drafted a petition. And that petition, in its latest form, is back there. We got hundreds of thousands of signatures on the petition. I would go up every year up to Congress, and I'd go knock on doors, and I'd say, "Look how many signatures we've got. You know, will you please introduce this?" Nobody was interested in introducing it. And then a fellow showed up from Arizona, who had been part of the Impeach Governor Meekum campaign. And Governor Meekum had refused to honor the Martin Luther King holiday in the late 1980s. And so Joe Vigorito was part of the impeachment campaign. And when he came to D.C. and he saw us, he said, "You're not going to get anywhere by just getting people from around the world and around the country to sign this petition. What you need is a voter initiative." So that's what we did. We started in 1990 and went and met with the Board of Elections and argued our case, and they said, "Okay, you can do it." The way that we worded it was that the citizens of D.C. asked the mayor of D.C. to write a letter to the representative of D.C. asking that, at that time it was he and then it became she, introduce a constitutional amendment to abolish nuclear weapons. And that was what the initiative was about. And Eleanor Holmes Norton, who had just become the representative in D.C., she came on the radio right before the election and she said that if it passed, she was not going to introduce it, because if she were to introduce a constitutional amendment, she would be a laughingstock in Congress. And so after we won with 57% of the vote and people coming out of the voting booth saying, "How could you vote against this?" She changed her mind after we negotiated with her and said, "Well, we don't have to have a constitutional amendment. The bill is good enough, you know, it's fine. It's good to ask for more than you really want, because then you can negotiate something that everybody can agree on." So she started introducing the bill in 1994. It's called the Nuclear Weapons Abolition and Economic and Energy Conversion Act. And last year's session, 2015, 2016, it was HR 1976. And what it's asking is that our government promise the world that we will take a leadership role in negotiating a nuclear weapons ban treaty, and that we will use the money, the billions of dollars saved each year, to shut down and clean up the nuclear weapons industry, which arguably also includes nuclear power plants, because nuclear power plants are producing weapons-grade plutonium and uranium all the time. And until we get rid of the nuclear power plants, we'll never know whether we get rid of nuclear weapons. And besides which, wind and solar are now self-sufficient and starting to make money for people, so it's a good industry. And the money should be used, earmarked, for converting the other arms industries into something that's good for people. And one of the things in the later versions of the bill, the initial version didn't talk about clean energy, but in the later versions of the bill, it specifically means carbon-free, nuclear-free energy. So move the money from weapons to clean energy. You pay the factory owners to retool their factories and retrain their workers, and you pay the workers to get retrained, and then they start producing something that we really need. Nobody loses, everybody wins, and it'll be good for the environment. So, and it also has a clause in there about making a good faith effort to end war and all military conflict. Now that seems to be a sticking point for a lot of people. But it's the good faith. They say they want to end war, you know, but they don't act like they want to end war. And so what we need is for the rhetoric to become the reality. Like President Obama said, you know, it would be wonderful to have a world without nuclear weapons, but then he said, but perhaps not in my lifetime. Well, phooey with that. I'd like to see it before I die. How about you? So, I've got a foldover flyer here, back here. Maybe we could pass those out. There's a small number of people here. Do any of you know who Carol Erner is? Are you all WILF members? Who are not WILF members? Well, you need to be. We need you. Do you know about WILP?
A little bit.
Okay.
Through a little bit reading.
Well, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom was established in 1915 by Jane Addams and her friends to end what was then known as the Great War, and we now call World War I. And WILP has been fighting war, or not, but the word fighting is a bad word. We really need to work on the vocabulary. They have been working for peace and against war for a very long time. And when nuclear weapons came along, we definitely started working against that. I was recruited by a wonderful woman by the name of Carol Erner, who lives on the West Coast. She's now 87 years old. But last year, she and I traveled up the West Coast and up the East Coast on the first nuclear-free future tours, and I learned a whole lot from her. And she has written this flyer here, which is about let's end the whole nuclear era. And it gives you some, I'm going to go over it with you, if you don't mind, a little bit. To abolish nuclear weapons, we must abolish nuclear power. I've covered that. Mining uranium leaves waste that pollutes soil and water, causing a high level of cancer in surrounding areas. I drove through Moab, Utah in 2009 after my husband died. I took a tour of the country and visited people and places that I've been wanting to visit. And in Moab, Utah, there's this little bitty river, and there's these wonderful rock formations, or sandstone formations, or whatever they are. And then right next to the river is a uranium mine that was right next to the river and uncovered for 50 years. And if you've gone out west, they don't have much water out there. So there are 1,500 uranium mines right now that need to be cleaned up. And Charmaine Whiteface, a WILF member and a Lakota Sioux member, started Defenders of the Black Hills and have been lobbying. Raul Grijalva of Arizona said that he would introduce a uranium mining moratorium and cleanup act. He hasn't done it yet. And so my asks here today are for you folks to think about some of the asks that you can make to your representatives in order to start solving these problems. So you could say that you support a uranium mining moratorium and cleanup act. Disposal of nuclear waste is still a problem without a solution, and during the Obama administration there was the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Energy. And there were, I don't know if any of you were part of this, but there were hearings in communities all over the country where they took testimonies from people about what they thought should be done with the nuclear waste. And my colleagues in Alliance for Nuclear Accountability, which has started, let's see, about 37 years ago. It's a group of people who live on the outskirts of nuclear weapons facilities, who have been lobbying for cleanup, and they also have gotten more and more involved in getting rid of the nuclear weapons as well. They have done studies, there's engineers who have done studies, and it's really, except in some cases where it's on an earthquake zone right next to the water, or it's likely to be hit by a hurricane, or, you know, in most cases, the best thing to do with this stuff is hardened on-site storage, at least for now, until we figure out what ultimately to do with it. Yucca Mountain is out, although they keep trying to resurrect it, because there are earthquakes there all the time, and there's an aquifer that feeds 4 states that is just about the only water around, and if the radioactivity gets into that, it would be disastrous. Speaking of radioactivity getting into water, the first place that I went on this tour was Johnson City, Tennessee, and I met with Linda Modica, who's a wonderful Wilk member, recent Wilk member, who has been, since 2010, has been doing research on nuclear fuel services, which was built 60 years ago on the very beautiful Nolechucky River in the mountains of Tennessee. And this river is a real favorite for rafters and kayakers and canoers and swimmers and fishermen. This river is what people get their drinking water out of. And for 60 years, Nuclear Fuel Services, which originally was built to make fuel rods for the nuclear navy, and recently has been reprocessing those fuel rods, which produces plutonium. They have been leaking plutonium and uranium and tritium and other toxic stuff into this beautiful little river. And there were 42 houses that were poled on one street, a few blocks from the river and a few more blocks from Nuclear Fuel Services, which takes up a huge portion of this valley. And out of those 42 houses, there were 27 of them that had cancer deaths or cancer survivors. That's a very high percentage of the population. And Linda Modica and her friends, they call themselves the Wall of Women. And they lobbied the NRC at a time when they were being listened to have an official cancer study done, and to shut down nuclear fuel services and to make them responsible for cleaning up as much as they could. And they were making some headway, but then the head of the NRC lost his job, and the cancer study was canceled, and the plant has now been extended another 25 years. So this is a disaster zone. When I filmed 3 people, interviewed 3 people, and put them up on a Facebook page that I've got set up for this tour, Nuclear Free Future Tour on Facebook. If you look that up, and you'll see Irwin, Tennessee, and then Kenneth Edwards. And it's a very interesting story and very, very disturbing, because this is, as Mark Hames said today on the radio show, this is just one of so many examples, like the Westlake landfill. In St. Louis, there was a speaker that I'm going to be putting her talk up as soon as I can about the Westlake landfill and their efforts to get some funding to be able to move this community that was built there, and people are getting sick.